We know that meditation reduces the inflammatory load on the system. We know it increases neuroplasticity. We know it from a psychoneuroimmunology perspective, it calms the whole nervous system, so reduces our stress-related load on the system.
Ashok is a practitioner who has dedicated his life to supporting people through chronic illness and ultimately helping them achieve their potential. He has the classic pain to passion story, suffering from ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. He has a never give up attitude that drove him to do neurological research and find a solution to his condition. He pushed this research into the scientific world, publishing peer-reviewed research on the neurological processes he discovered. And then he created his well-known neuroplasticity recovery program known as the Gupta Program. He is here today to talk about the impressive connection between our neurology and many, if not all, of our chronic conditions many are facing as we aim to live longer.
Sleep is something that we don't hold as sacred in our civilization. And the number one thing that's interrupting our sleep right now is...
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms.
Hi, and welcome to the next episode of the Live Beyond the Norms Health and Longevity podcast. I met our next guest at the recent Mindshare Collaborative Summit. I don't remember the specifics of our first conversation. I just remember thinking I need to get to his booth, which was just down the aisle from my booth. I got busy and I did not get a chance to visit his booth, but I bumped into him at the very end, at the very last event. In fact, the email I sent to make this episode happen was sent at 11:32 p.m. This happened to be a pool party that closes the event. I am really happy I attended the pool party, and I'm looking forward to diving into some amazing, probably mind-boggling learnings here. As I was preparing for this podcast, I learned that Ashok is a practitioner who has dedicated his life to supporting people through chronic illness and ultimately helping them achieve their potential. He has the classic pain to passion story, suffering from ME or chronic fatigue syndrome while studying at Cambridge University. I guess that part is not classic for many people. He has a never give up attitude that drove him to do neurological research and find a solution to his condition. He pushed this research into the scientific world, publishing peer-reviewed research on the neurological processes he discovered. And then he created his well-known neuroplasticity recovery program known as the Gupta Program. He is here today to talk about the impressive connection between our neurology and many, if not all, of our chronic conditions many are facing as we aim to live longer. Ashok, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction, and delighted to be here.
Glad you made the pool party.
Yes, it was fun.
Focusing on your Gupta program for 22 years, as you have, takes a lot of focus and dedication. As a fellow business owner, I'm sure you had many frustrating times. It is a unique personality that can drive this for so long. If you think about growing up, where does this piece of your personality, that drive, come from?
You know, I think it's what can sometimes be known as the immigrant mentality. Yeah. So my family were immigrants into the UK in the 70s. And, you know, in those times, 70s and 80s in the UK, there was certainly racism, there was prejudice. And like my family say, you've got to be twice as good as the guy next to you in order to succeed in this dog-eat-dog world. So that was the kind of, pressure that as a young person I was kind of put under. And I think that drove me and made me strive to want to get educated, want to do the best that I could for myself and my family. So perhaps some of the drive came from that. But really with this illness and treating these various illnesses, that drive came from my own experience. So when you've gone through the suffering, the pain yourself, and you see that millions around the world are also suffering from these types of illnesses, then of course you want to do whatever you can to help and support them. And that's really been my driver.
Yeah, I can imagine that, the testimonials, we spoke before we got started, that a lot of your business comes from referrals, and that means that they had such an amazing response to your program. That's got to feel good when you hear about that. Before we get into kind of more details of the program, what have been some of the most challenging things you've faced? Because you have published some research, and you got to complete the research, and then you got to get it published. Like, what does that look like for you?
I think that the challenges really have been the funding. So as you can imagine, a lot of modern medical research is very focused on pharmaceuticals, right? And it's very difficult to get funding for supplements and various other things, never mind an intervention like ours, which doesn't fit into the classical buckets of research. And I think that's been the main thing. And so it's been funding these things on shoestring budgets, partnering with universities, investing ourselves as well. I think that's been the main challenge. But I think, slowly now we've done 6 studies and we've done 4 randomized control trials, 2 large clinical audits. So we're beginning to really get that base of evidence and body of evidence to show that this approach really works.
All right, I want to come back to the studies and let's talk a little bit about your kind of pain to passion story. You were suffering, I believe it was undergraduate, maybe it was graduate. Talk a little bit about what you were going through. What did you first notice, right? This is a lot to unpack here. How did it first impact you? What were the traditional solutions that you explored, and then ultimately what caused you to kind of search out a non-traditional solution?
Sure. So my journey started in the mid-90s. And as you know, in those days, the idea of neuroplasticity or even alternative and complementary treatments was still in its infancy. And I had contracted some kind of virus. I was in my 3rd year of university. I got some kind of virus. And the virus seemed to go away, but my symptoms seemed to get worse and worse, to the point at which I had to crawl to the bathroom. I had no energy. I describe it like your worst day of flu times 5.
Wow.
Right. So just to think of that, the worst day of flu, you just have zero energy, and it doesn't matter how much you rest, how much you do anything or don't do anything, you still feel exactly the same, no matter what. And I would pick up a textbook and not be able to read the words on the page and think, what has happened? Have I suddenly become a 100-year-old person? Like I literally can't do anything. What's happened here? And I would go from doctor to doctor, and they would say, we don't know what you have. We don't know what to call it. There's no treatment for it. By the way, you might have it for the rest of your life. Goodbye. And to a young man, that was almost like a life sentence. Like, what does this mean? And I had also met many others who were suffering similarly. And finally, I got a diagnosis of ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as it's often known. And still, that didn't really help you. And I made a contract with the universe. And I said, if I can just get myself 50% well, 80% well, even 100% well, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping people with this condition. Because I experienced that depth of suffering that you have. And many people with these conditions, whether it's CFS, whether it's long COVID, fibromyalgia, they often compare the level of suffering to final stage cancer in terms of the pain, the tiredness, the weakness. And there was one special day, I was at a bookstore in Cambridge, and I was trying to figure out, in those days we actually used bookstores and actually did our research in books. And I tried to figure out, what can I read to try and get myself well? And there was one book that was just jutting out of the shelf. And it just called to me, and you can't explain these things. There was one book. And I thought, why is that book sticking out? All right, I want to know what that book is. And I picked that book off the shelf, and it was the most pivotal book of my entire research. It was called The Emotional Life of the Brain by Professor Joseph Ledoux, who in those days was the pioneer in brain research related to the amygdala and conditioning effects in the brain. And I read that book and I realized, this is the reason for my condition. And in an ad hoc way, I started building models of what was going on in my brain and my body, and managed to retrain my brain through my own techniques, got myself 100% well, and then set up a clinic to treat others, and then wrote a medical hypothesis, which I published online in 1999, and then in a medical journal in 2002. And since then, I then worked with patients one-on-one for about 10 years, healing them. And then we published the first neuroplasticity program in 2007, the first brain retraining program. And since then, as I said, we've published 7 or 8 papers, and we've got 4 randomized control trials and 2 clinical audits, and now an app and daily sessions and a whole suite of things. So that's been my 25-year, 30-year journey to get us to where we are now.
I've got to ask one, so you see this book, you pull the book down. Were you just at a position, like maybe in the past you would have read that title and just like tossed the book aside, but you were in such a desperate situation, you're like, well, like reading this can't hurt? Like what was your belief as you're reading through that particular book?
I can't explain it. I just knew that was a book I needed to read. And I can't explain why that is or how that happened. And, we all have our own belief systems as to this kind of thing. But literally, I saw that book and I pulled it off the shelf and it just appealed to me. It said, I've got to read this book. And because it was written by a neuroscientist and I had already intuitively felt that there's something going on, although the symptoms are manifesting in the physical body, there's something going on in my brain that I can't explain on the periphery of my consciousness that is keeping this cycle going, that is keeping my body unwell in this inflammatory state. And that was it. The book just called to me. It's just something I had to read. And, there is this grander theory that all the knowledge of the entire universe already exists. It's just a question of tapping into it. And, many people have said that. Many people have discovered new discoveries or found new things, new ways of doing things. They've said, it just came to me. I can't explain it. And that was what happened with this particular hypothesis. It's
kind of like the phrase, when the student is ready, the teacher will come, right? And so that was kind of some of the thought around that question. I think some of the concept is AIR. I think that's right. What is this hypothesis? What is its relationship with chronic illness? Give us some of that background that you learned, I think, in that original book, and that was The Emotional Life of the Brain
by Professor Joseph Ledoux. Yes. So I always like to. I think starting off with this hypothesis, I always like to ask the biggest question of all: why are we here?
Yeah.
Now, we could have a fantastic
start with a small question.
No, let's not start with any small questions. Let's get to the biggest question of all: why are we here? So we can have a wonderful philosophical debate about why we are here over the next half an hour. But let me actually look at it from a scientific perspective. So we are here as human beings because we are survival machines. Okay. So we have learnt to survive from plants to single-cell organisms, invertebrates, vertebrates, reptiles, mammals, human beings. We've come along that evolutionary journey. And believe it or not, we actually contain the lineage. We actually contain the DNA of all of those previous incarnations of life. And that's because our system has learned to adapt to environment, survive, and pass on our genes to the next generation. So if we look at it purely from a scientific perspective, we are here because we can survive, adapt, and procreate. And so if we take that as our starting point, then the system is designed to keep us alive, not to keep us well. And that is the key perspective that helps us explain probably 70% of the illnesses that we see right now in the modern world, modern illnesses. Yeah? And it can explain neuroimmune conditions, autoimmune conditions, inflammatory diseases, pain conditions, can all be explained by that one phrase: our brain doesn't care about our well-being, it cares about our survival. Okay? So let me frame all of this in a hypothesis. So let's take an example of COVID. Yep. So we've all experienced COVID. We've all have been through these journeys. And so normally when infection comes along, our body recognizes that. So we have our immune system and nervous system. It recognizes there's a threat, stimulates an immune response so we can fight off that threat. Once it's gone, the system comes back to normal. So far, so good. But if the system is under threat and is receiving multiple threats and multiple insults on the system, it then feels that it's under threat almost continuously. Yeah? And if we look at our modern world, we're experiencing so many threats right now that we didn't used to experience in previous generations. So we aren't living according to our evolutionary biology. So until a few hundred years ago, we used to live outdoors. Now we live in boxes 93% of the time. We don't have access to clean air and light. We eat food which has toxins, pesticides, etc. We don't eat food that is fresh. We eat processed foods. And of course, we are under more stress, and we spend most of our time leaning over, sedentary, looking at screens. Yeah, pardon this particular experience, of course. and so, if we take all of that, the system is constantly under threat. So then, when it experiences a new threat, like a virus or bacteria, that might be the camel, or rather not the camel, the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yep.
And pushes us over the edge into chronic illness, where so an acute illness can turn into a chronic illness. So let's take the example of long COVID. When people suffer from long COVID, normally their immune system kicks in, they fight off the virus, and they get back to baseline. But if the person is weaker for whatever reason, then the system may over-respond and overreact. And we already have that evidence in the people who passed away from COVID, unfortunately. They didn't pass away from COVID, they passed away because their own immune system overstimulated, created a cytokine storm, and then overwhelmed their breath and tightened up all of their lungs, and therefore they weren't able to breathe anymore. So that's what actually people passed away from, not the virus itself per se. So to put this into context, let's take the what I call the Game of Thrones analogy, or let's call it the fairy tale analogy. Chris, are you a fan of Game of Thrones?
I haven't watched it. I'm sure I would be if I ever watch it. I do like long series. I do like the genre that it represents. I'm sure I would enjoy it. Except apparently I would not enjoy the ending, because apparently nobody enjoyed the ending.
I enjoyed the ending. There we go.
Oh, no.
I must be the outlier. I'm the outlier. Exactly. So let's take a fairy tale analogy. So I want you to imagine you are King Chris of your empire, of your castle, let's say, right? And you have an army, which is your nervous system, and a navy, which is your immune system. All right, so they defend your castle and your kingdom against invading armies. All right, so far so good. Now imagine there's a drought in the kingdom. So now the kingdom is weaker as a result of that drought, and your army and navy are weaker as well. Now an invading army comes over the hill. So in the case of long COVID, that invading army is the COVID infection. In the case of fibromyalgia, that might be a pain, a localized pain. In the case of mold illness or Lyme disease, that would be Lyme or mold. Some kind of threat on the system, virus, bacterial, or toxin. And now your army and navy have to work twice as hard to fight off this incoming invader, because they're weaker than they are normally. And it takes them a lot longer to fight off this infection, which is why we know that there's an elongated period of post-viral fatigue after these types of illnesses. And now your army generals, your soldiers, your navy are traumatized by the effects of that war, because they only just managed to fight off that virus. Because remember our first principle, the brain cares more about your survival than it does your well-being. So now they come to their weekly meeting with King Chris, the army and navy generals, and they say, King Chris, it's got a nice ring to it, King Chris.
Yeah, I like her. Yeah.
If you were a rapper, that would be your rapper name, I think. So if you imagine the army generals and navy generals, they say, King Chris, we need all resources of your kingdom. We need all the wheat, the corn, the metal, the clean water. Everything should be funneled to us, because if the kingdom falls, it's all over. We should be the priority. So you think naturally that's the right thing to do. So all the resources go now to the army and navy, and they start firing off their weapons of war continuously, just in case the invader is hiding in the forest or in the valley. They keep firing off the weapons, but some of those weapons start falling back into the kingdom, and that's when you start getting the autoimmune effects and the inflammatory effects in the system, where our own immune system starts impacting on the kingdom itself, on the body itself. And then what happens is opportunistic spies start flourishing in the kingdom, because the Secret Service is no longer being funded. So now we have opportunistic infections, bacterial infections, viruses start flourishing in the system. And the system is no longer detoxing. So normally there are people who clean the kingdom, right? But your detoxification system is shut down. Heavy metals start accumulating. Viruses, bacteria, mycotoxins start flourishing in the system, which then contribute to the more and more weakness in the system. Which means that the army generals now say, we need even more resources to fire off our weapons of war. And the whole system now stays in this lack state, this lack of homeostasis. Yeah? And as far as the body is concerned, it's doing the right thing. It's ensuring survival by stimulating inflammatory responses in this threatening environment that we live in, which makes us feel ill, causes lots of physical symptoms in the body, fatigue, exhaustion, cognitive difficulties, gut dysbiosis, a ton of gut problems. But the brain says, but survival matters, survival matters. And then we stay stuck in this state. And brain retraining is when we have a meeting with our army and navy generals. The next time we have a meeting, they say, King Chris, we need all the resources. you as King Chris say to them, my dear generals, you have done a wonderful job in defending this kingdom, but the war is over. You can stand down. And you might say, well, how on earth do we communicate with our immune system, right? It's just an autonomic system. It's an automatic system. And it's an involuntary system. And this is where the specialized tools in the Gupta program that we use, we spent many years curating those and being able to create a sense of safety in two brain structures, the amygdala and insula, which we'll talk about. But essentially, you as the king now tell them, the war is over, stand down. And the brain won't believe you the first time. So the Army and Navy won't believe you the first time. And this is where neuroplasticity comes in. You have to tell them again and again and again, creating new neural pathways in the brain of safety so that the whole system returns back to balance. And that, in a nutshell, is the hypothesis.
Okay, so you mentioned the amygdala and the insular, so talk about those components, right? So let me first kind of summarize, right? So you've had some insult and your system addressed that insult and then stayed in hyper address mode. And so everything else is just being carried along at a minimal rate, right? You kind of described crawling to the bathroom, like not being able to read a book, because you're right. The body is about staying alive. First off, I love the concept of your why question, because everybody thinks, why are we here moving forward? And that question is really about, I've never heard it like, why are we here? Like, what caused us to be here? Right? And it is just survival. It is not thriving, doesn't necessarily cause us to be here. It's not living a happy life, doesn't necessarily cause us to be here. It's the fact that we did survive for a number of reasons. I think that's fantastic. So now you've got the system that's just in total distress, and there's no path to getting healthy, and you're getting in there, and the brain's driving this, right? So your autonomic nervous system is driving this, and you're like, okay, let's work on reprogramming that. Talk about kind of amygdala and the insular, and first, what are those in the brain, and then what do you think's going on as you're going through this process?
We talk about those two brain structures, the amygdala and insula, but of course the entire brain is involved. But we believe the core conditioning, which I'll come on to in a moment, the core conditioning of the brain occurs in the amygdala and insula. So to start off with the amygdala, we have two of them. They're small almond-shaped structures that are behind our eyes. Okay, so they are in the limbic system part of the brain. And they have many roles, but the core role is to detect threats and to warn the rest of the brain that we're undergoing some kind of threat. And traditionally in medicine, we think of biological threats in terms of running from a wild tiger, the fight or flight response. Mm-hmm. But actually, the amygdala has been shown to be involved in immune threats and pain threats as well. Yeah. And another part of the brain is called the insula. And the insula sits between the limbic system and the cortex. It's actually part of the cortex, sometimes known as the insular cortex. And that part of the brain, its job is to take in all the incoming data from the body, so through the vagus nerve and other channels, process that information in terms of autonomic information, immune information, external environmental information, gather it together and say, right, what do we need to do to ensure health, well-being, longevity, survival? And it puts all that data together and creates the emotional context of how the body is feeling. Yep. So the amygdala and insula work together to help us survive. And we believe that in the conditioning hypothesis that I've just mentioned, conditioning essentially means creating new neural pathways that become habits. Yeah? So traditionally the brain said, hey, there's no threat, I can be in standby mode. But the brain learns a conditioning effect and learns that symptoms in my body may indicate ongoing presence of that original insult or that threat. Let's keep triggering the immune system and nervous system. And we believe the nervous system conditioning or learning happens in the amygdala, and the immune system conditioning occurs in the insula or insular cortex. And that's why we target those two brain structures. And that book, The Emotional Life of the Brain, Professor Joseph Ledoux talked a lot about conditioning effects in the amygdala part of the brain. And my subsequent research then realized that actually the immune conditioning occurs in the insular part of the brain. And let me share some fascinating research which really puts this into context. And as I said, could explain 70 to 80% of the illnesses that someone goes to see a doctor for. So this is really important stuff.
70 to 80% of the reasons people go to doctors could be because of what you're about to discuss. I think I wanted to reiterate that because I think that's, I mean, if you ever have any doubts about what the brain controls, then you're not paying attention to like the placebo effect, like a 48% positive impact when you're not given a drug. Like the brain controls everything. So yeah, jump into that, please.
No, absolutely. And traditional medicine has been focused on what we can measure. So it measures things in the physical body, of course. But the brain has been this black box. We haven't figured it out until very recently. In the last 20 years or so, there's been progress. And because it's been the black box, medicine has mainly focused on what it can measure. And now we're in a whole new era of medicine, realizing that actually neuroplasticity, the brain, is the future. It's what controls so many of our different conditions. So let me come on to this piece, the insular part of the brain. Now, when we have an immune response, it is traditionally thought that the immune response was peripheral. So if you, let's say, have a little cut on your leg, you've injured yourself, the immune system at a localized level knows what to do. But interestingly, it's always been thought that that information must be stored centrally somewhere, and there must be an intelligence in that immune system to know the next time that thing happens, we know what to do. And now we know that's in the insular part of the brain, or probably in the insular part. And let me describe some scenarios or some experiments that have been done. So they'd taken rats, and they gave rats sweet water combined with an immunosuppressant. And they repeated that 5 times. Sweet water and immunosuppressant, sweet water and immunosuppressant. And they found, guess what? After 5 rounds of doing that, they gave the rats just sweet water without the immunosuppressant. And guess what happened? The immune system of these rats went down, even though there was no immunosuppressant. So that's what we call a conditioning effect. The brain had learned to create a response to something that's meaningless. Sweet water, completely meaningless. And when they dissected the brains, they found that the conditioning was due to the amygdala and insula working together, and in the longer term was stored in the insular part of the brain, which is really fascinating. And then recent research by Dr. Assia Rolls' team, they took rats and they gave rats inflammatory bowel disease by putting an irritant into their guts. They put an irritant in the guts, that created IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. And they measured the electrical signature in the insular part of the brain. That's the only thing that they did. They brought these rats back to baseline, so now the rats are nice and healthy. They then trigger that exact same electrical signature just in the insula. That's all they did. They recreated exactly the same inflammatory bowel disease in the guts of these rats. It's the first time it's been demonstrated on the planet, as far as we know, that a peripheral immune reaction, inflammatory bowel disease, caused in the gut, that information of how that was done and how it protected us and ensured survival, that information flows up through the vagus nerve and other channels into the insular part of the brain, so the insula can gather that information, store it, so that the next time we have that insult, it knows exactly what to do. Because the brain is efficient, it's a survival machine, and it says, if I was successfully able to overcome that threat on day 1, I want to be able to successfully overcome that threat on day 100 or day 200, whenever it might appear again in my environment. So it seems that the insula is the part of the brain that stores these conditioned responses. But it's also the part of the brain that is involved in emotional contexts. And so what it could be is that certain emotions that we may experience may re-trigger some of these latent immune responses, which would explain why in anxiety research or when we're stressed, we have inflammatory responses that seem to co-occur. And that actually a lot of people with these illnesses describe that when they feel stressed, they tend to have worse symptoms as well. Right? And so it shows us that potentially this could be a unifying hypothesis for, first of all, neuroimmune diseases. So chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, long COVID. All of those illnesses may be due to conditioning in the insular part of the brain, where the brain thinks, if I've got symptoms in my body, I might still have that virus or bacteria. Quick, trigger the immune system and nervous system, which then creates the symptoms. And the symptoms loop back to the sensitive brain. The brain says, we're in danger. Triggers the immune system and nervous system, creates the symptoms in the body. Come back to the brain. Round and around we go. So that could explain chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID and all these chronic diseases. Then we have sensitivity reactions like mold illness, chemical sensitivities, environmental toxin sensitivity. That could simply be that conditioning in the insula that 100% exposure creates 100% reaction. But then in the future, let's say with mold, 5% exposure creates 100% reaction. So the brain becomes hypersensitive and conditioned to create these inflammatory responses. Then pain. We know in pain research, the insula is certainly coming up as a core part of pain and pain conditioning. And so it's more developed in that particular arena of medicine. But also pain follows a similar pathway. We have pain, the brain starts becoming hyper aware and hyper vigilant of that pain, triggering inflammatory responses in the body, creating the very pain that it's sensitive to, creating once again vicious cycles. And then autoimmune diseases like MS. At some point in time, the brain is threatened by a virus or bacterial infection. It then creates an inflammatory response, but then starts triggering that inflammatory response in the future to otherwise benign triggers. Hence in MS, we know that often people get MS as a result of Epstein-Barr virus, because the brain may miscalculate and think that certain aspects of our nervous system and our spinal cord are actually very similar to EBV, and then starts attacking them and inflaming those parts of our brain and body. Yeah? And so autoimmune diseases could be explained by this particular factor. And then, of course, any diseases where, even diseases like cancer, heart disease, where there's stress in the system and inflammatory responses, these inflammatory responses then reduce the effectiveness of our immune system overall, which then means that then that contributes to so many other illnesses as well. So this unifying idea that our brain gets stuck in inflammatory responses could be the core reason for many modern diseases.
Hey, super quick break from the podcast. Hopefully you're loving it. This is a way you can support the podcast and take advantage of a great offer. We're offering 50% off of one of our MCT bottles. MCT is an amazing oil. Add the ESS60 molecule to it. It's even more amazing. All you got to do is leave a review on iTunes, send us a notification that you've left that review. We'll get you a coupon code that'll get you 50% off of our MCT oil and free shipping. Back to the podcast.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there. They give the rats irritable bowel syndrome and then figure out where that gets stored in the brain, trigger that in the brain, and it creates irritable bowel syndrome.
Inflammatory bowel disease.
I'm sorry, inflammatory bowel syndrome. So that's crazy. It's kind of like you think about the study that they did where they took a pencil and stuck it in people's mouths as they went through an activity and then rated how happy they were during the activity. And because holding a pencil in your mouth makes you smile, or at least triggers the muscles that cause you to smile, you felt happier, right? So the parallels make sense as, I don't know, potentially shocking as they are, right? Like it feels shocking that triggering a spot in the brain would cause this irritation. It also makes me think of, I don't know how much you've kind of dived into NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and they have a process for people who are even anaphylactic level allergic to bee stings, and they'll just train the brain actually to see the bee as a different insect, and they can actually, in some cases, get rid of this extreme reaction to the bee sting, right? Because it's an overreaction. If you're going into anaphylactic shock, it's an overreaction to what's happening to you, because the person next to you could get stung by a bee, and that wouldn't happen. Have you kind of died?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I'm very well aware. It's called the fast allergy cure in NLP, and that's a similar principle, which is that the brain is storing these sensitivity reactions because it's doing what it's been programmed to do. But if you can find the right key to the right lock and unlock that programming, then you can train the brain to see things as benign and not sensitive. So we've had a lot of people use our program for hay fever. So they first use it for mold and chemical sensitivities. They'll walk past someone wearing perfume and suddenly have this massive reaction. But they can train their brain that it's safe, it's nothing to worry about. And then they start thinking, well, what about hay fever? Maybe I can train my brain for that. And they were able to lower their hay fever reactions. So we can see that a lot of modern diseases are essentially our own nervous and immune systems protecting us unnecessarily because of the inflammatory, threatening world that we live in. And if we could control that, we can get our systems back to balance. And this is the important piece. If our systems are responding unnecessarily, with random inflammatory responses to various things, it reduces the overall effectiveness of our immune system, which then can contribute to conditions like cancer and others. And therefore, fixing this and getting the system to its optimal state is absolutely crucial.
I love now the science, and I want to get into, again, some of the studies and randomized controls and what those showed. But I want to go back to, you get the book and you start this process on yourself. You said it doesn't work the first time, right? Like you don't just say some mantra and your brain's reprogrammed. What was that process like because you were convinced it would work? Did you ever enter like some frustration? And then what was the recovery like, right? So at some point, difficult to read a book, crawling to the bathroom, and then you're like, what does that growth look like for you?
Very up and down. So I remember that time. It's very challenging because you don't know if it's going to work. There's no studies behind it. You're just experimenting with your brain. And yet I just knew intuitively that this was the answer and I had to keep going. And I didn't know about the idea of repetition at the time. I just thought if I do this repeatedly for long enough, the brain will get the message. Like learning to play the piano or a musical instrument. You can't expect the first time that you're suddenly going to be able to do it. You have to train your nervous system to play that sonnet or that piece of music. And that is where the regularity and the repetition really, really come in and really kick in. So it was very frustrating and lots of ups and downs, but it was always like, I can see that this is the core reason I need to just keep going with this process.
So do you think that that the Gupta program deals, like everything it's dealing with is inflammation and chronic inflammation, or are there other things that you think it's helping to address?
I think it's addressing putting the system back to its homeostasis, to its optimal healing state. So I almost say, get your brain out of the way, or get your danger responses out of the way, and your system will recover and get back to balance. And so that's relevant for a whole host of different conditions. So even things like depression, we know that half of depression cases are really cases of excessive inflammation in the system. So I think that what we're seeing here is if we can address this overinflammation, we can bring our systems back to balance, then our bodies can naturally detoxify, naturally deal with opportunistic infections, naturally get us back to energy and health. A lot of fatigue that people experience is because we've got draining of the immune system and nervous system, or overstimulation of our inflammatory responses. So it's a universal concept I think we're all experiencing, in the modern world. And lack of sleep, sedentary lifestyles, toxic food, all of these things increase inflammation. So from a holistic perspective, we're not just saying retrain the brain, it's also important to do all these other pieces as well. And the key mediator of this, and Chris, obviously this is not something you need me to tell you, is the gut. The gut is the key mediator of all of these processes, because gut is where 70% of our immune system sits. So the gut is getting signals from the brain that we're in danger. So the gut starts inflaming and getting hyperprotective over the food that it's consuming, which then makes it hypersensitive and then makes it more prone to leaky gut, more prone to gut dysbiosis, balance of bacteria changes, the gut tightens up, which then sends messages back to the brain that we're under threat, which then fuels the brain's threat mechanisms even more. So the gut and the brain start interacting and playing a vicious game of tennis, hitting the ball harder and harder against each other as well. So that's also a cause of the brain inflammation, the body inflammation, and getting stuck in this particular state. That's so using this tool as a solution for leaky gut. It's very interesting. I interviewed Dr. Stephen Gundry, who still sees patients 6 days a week, and he says everybody who comes in has leaky gut. In fact, everybody who comes in has antibodies to wheat in their blood, which means chunks o' wheat. That's my own phraseology. He doesn't say it that way. have gotten through the gut barrier, which is proof of leaky gut, and then that he can heal that. And so if you're healing the leaky gut with this kind of mind-gut connection, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like the overall inflammatory response is going to drop. I remember I interviewed Tom O'Brien, and when I interviewed him, I asked him a question. I don't think he'd ever thought of it. Maybe he had thought of it, but the question was,
if you think about autoimmune conditions as conditions of inflammation, I mean, we certainly in this modern era are aware of a spectrum, right? Like you're not, it's not that you just have something or you don't have it, that there's this spectrum that you're on. I believe that's probably true of inflammation. We all have some inflammation, and are we at a high level of chronic inflammation or are we at a low level? Do you think your program is like good for everyone? Do you think this is something that's smart that everyone should be doing?
It's funny you say that, Chris, because people who go on our program say exactly that. That our program is agnostic in the sense that whatever you want to change mentally, physically, emotionally, biologically, this is a program of change, right? Of improvement, of becoming the best version of yourself. So there's always something we want to improve. Do we want to improve some anxious thoughts? Do we want to improve an immune reaction? It's this, the science of neuroplasticity, the science of change. So everyone could benefit from it in some shape or form. And I think that this is about what is the optimal healing state for our system. It is when the nervous system and immune system are finely tuned to be in that standby mode. And what actually is the issue, because people think, oh, well, if the immune system's on, that's a good thing because it's protecting me, right? But if it's on unnecessarily, that's where the issue lies. So we've got to refine the system. And this is where it comes down to, is the system under-regulating or over-regulating? So we all have an immune system that's responding to threats all the time. Like, people don't realize this, but we are constantly bombarded by bacteria in our environment, by viruses in our environment, toxins in our environment. Our immune system is constantly fighting these things off. But the question is, does it do it with a minimal noise in terms of, hey, I'm a hyper-efficient set of soldiers who go in, deal with the threats and come back to standby? Or because the system is weaker, are they spending a lot longer doing that, using up the resources of the system? Or indeed overreacting and using too many resources, in which case then we get illness. And Chris, this final point, this hypothesis also explains the placebo effect, the self-healing effect, even spiritual healing. Because what we say in brain retraining is, you're training your brain that you are no longer in danger. And if we say that 70% of the conditions that we see in a modern practice may be due to this underlying hypothesis, then naturally, if somebody takes a sugar pill and believes, oh, this pill is going to make me feel better, it's going to heal me, the stronger that they believe that, they are training their brain and sending safety signals to the insula part of the brain and the amygdala part of the brain that we are no longer under threat by this particular virus or bacteria or whatever it may be, which then brings the system back to its standby mode in terms of the immune system and nervous system, hence creating positive effects on the symptomatology. And the stronger someone believes that that pill is going to heal them, the more of the brain retraining effect it has. So it could be that the placebo effect, the self-healing effect, is simply retraining over-inflammatory defensive responses using the power of belief.
This brain retraining, mentally, emotionally, and biologically, I think that's something, as you inspect it intellectually, makes perfect sense, right? Because of the placebo effect, because of things that we know that the brain controls, everything. Right? But it is also not common thought, right? Like, you just don't think. How do you think meditation and breathing sit in, right? I think there's health benefits. There's certainly mental benefits there. There's probably documented health benefits there. But that's not focused on retraining. How would you kind of compare, contrast like meditation and great breathing with kind of your retraining?
Yeah, great question. So actually, breath work, somatic work, meditation is our preparation for brain retraining. Yeah? Because they do impact on the brain. And let me describe it in this way. So imagine you have a field and there is a river running through that field. Yeah? And that river has been there for millennia, digging that pathway in that soil. Yeah? And that pathway represents a neuron in our brain. Yeah? A stimulus interpretation response model. The stimulus is what we potentially afraid of or what is dangerous. The interpretation is it dangerous or not? The response is trigger an immune response or a nervous system response. Yeah? So that's the river flowing through the soil. But we want to redirect that river in a different direction. Yeah? So the brain retraining is saying we want to dig a new neural pathway in the brain so that when the water comes down, the water doesn't go down the left-hand channel, it goes down the right-hand channel instead. But that ground is frozen solid. That river is never going to redivert whilst the ground is frozen solid. So somatic work, breath work and meditation is loosening up the soil, warming up the soil so it's looser, more neuroplastic. And there is evidence now that actually when people meditate and breathe, their brain becomes more flexible. They're more open to new ways of thinking and they are better able to create new neural pathways. We also know through meditation that 30 to 40 or 50 inflammatory genes are switched off. Right? So those over-inflammatory responses are calmed down so we come back to our baseline and the brain doesn't think we're in so much danger. So breathwork and meditation are our first point of call to loosen up the soil. Then brain retraining is saying, now that we've loosened the soil, let's dig this specific new neural pathway. Not just general neuroplasticity, but a specific neural pathway on the right-hand path. And that is the second stage. So level 1 of our program is relaxing and regulating the nervous system. Level 2 is rerouting. That is the retraining of the brain. And that's how meditation and breath work are so important. And to give an example of how they're so important in neuroplasticity, there was a study done in Harvard, 2015. Now, this study should have made world news. It should have been the most important thing that we discussed for years. And yet, because it wasn't a medication, it was just a side note. In this study, they tracked 5,000 people over a year, and they saw how much medical resources did they use? How often did they visit a doctor? How often did they visit a hospital? So they measured that for a year. Then they taught these people meditation, regular meditation, and some resiliency skills, how to be more resilient in your environment. But the core of it was how to stimulate your relaxation response through some breath work and deep meditation. Yeah? And they just had to do 20 minutes a day minimum. They followed those people for another year, and they also compared them to a control group. So this was one of the largest studies ever conducted on meditation. They found, wait for this, they found a 42% drop in usage of medical facilities. 42%. Okay? Now we're all looking, how can we reduce medical care costs in the world? I mean, in the US we spend 20% of GDP on medical services. It's crazy. And people are getting sicker and sicker, and now even longevity is being reversed. So, or rather, people are not living as long as they used to. Yeah. So how can this be going on? We have one simple solution. If we just taught as many people as possible in hospitals or just the general population to breathe and meditate, we could potentially use 42% less resources. That's a validated study, and I can send you that, and it should have made front page news. Because if that was a pill, that would be prescribed to every single person on this planet.
Yeah.
Right? If a pill could reduce your usage of medical facilities by 42%, I mean, isn't that absolutely insane? That has now been proven, and yet it's not something that we do as human beings. So that just shows you the power of breath work and meditation.
It makes me wonder, right, there's some really good sauna research that shows a 48% reduction in all-cause mortality, and you mentioned 42% drop in kind of medical needs. I wonder how much of the sauna work is just because you're sitting in a sauna for 20 minutes, which is a decent session. It actually has the parallel with the study you just referenced. It'd be interesting if they got into if that same study looked at all-cause mortality, because I think that I've always felt like no matter what you do, if you just go and concentrate, do something, whatever it is, even if just sit there and think about your health, you will be healthier. And I loved your example of the field and the river for a couple of reasons. So I signed up for your program, and I've gone through some of it. The videos are amazing. They're in a field, and there's a river probably going through it somewhere. Like, they're really well put together. I had a question about that. I think that's kind of less germane to I want to get into the science. And then you think about that redrawing or the new pathway of that river. And its permanency, right, in the image that you painted. I think Huberman, I saw a video that he did where he was like one 12-minute or 17, I think it's 12-minute, but I'm going to make my son do 17 minutes of meditation actually does rewire things, and you're actually better, you're more resilient after just one of those, because there's something about that time frame, and it really does reprogram at a level. I want to jump into, and be mindful of time here, talk about some of the studies that you've had published. Like, what are the things that you're like most proud of coming out of those and are most excited about, and share what you would love to share.
Yes, of course. So for us, the science behind this is super important. So people can claim all kinds of things. I mean, you can go onto Instagram and see 1,001 remedies for God knows what, with no backing whatsoever. So for us, getting the science right is super important. So we have a whole team dedicated to studies. And we've done now 6 studies. 5 of those were independent studies, so we weren't involved in the data collection or anything like that. We just provided our treatment. And in the studies, so as an example, the long COVID study, we're especially proud of that. So it compared the Gupta Program to a wellness program. So the wellness program had diet, supplements, sleep, activity. Now, all the good things we know can generally help boost our immune system. And they compared those 2 groups, and they found that after 3 months, the Gupta program was 4 times more effective at reducing fatigue and exhaustion. Yeah, and it's very rare in a medical study you get a 400% result or comparison. Twice as effective at increasing levels of energy. And we had close to a 97% improvement in energy levels in the patients compared to 47% in the control group. And this was a really interesting study because it helped a lot of functional and integrative doctors and nutritionists and naturopaths realize that, of course, the work they do is amazing and important and incredible. And this piece also is very important because of the 4 times better result that we got. So that was one study. Then we did a study on fibromyalgia.
Let me ask you a question there. So the control group had kind of dietary prescriptions, exercise prescriptions,
supplements,
and supplements.
Sleep.
So those things that you would normally say, here's what you need to do to go be healthier, and your program had a 4x positive impact over those things that people would normally do to be healthier. That's pretty phenomenal.
Exactly. That's a published independent RCT. So yeah, I'd love people to look that up. And then we did a study on fibromyalgia, which was just an 8-week study. And our program is a minimum 3 to 6 month program on the app, but this was just an 8-week study. And they found that comparing our program to a control group program, we had a 40% reduction in fibromyalgia scores, 40% in 8 weeks, 0% in the control group, and sorry, it was 37% in the active group, 0% in the control group, and then a halving of pain, halving of anxiety, halving of depression, and a 50% increase in functional capacity. That was just after 8 weeks, and very low amounts in the control groups. Yeah, so that's a published independent RCT.
And that control group was the same thing, food, exercise, or was there another control in that particular study?
That control group was relaxation. That was
okay. So meditation potentially, or just
exactly structurally equivalent in terms of time with a therapist.
Very cool.
And then we just recently published a clinical audit of our patients. It was an independent audit where an independent company came in, conducted an audit of our patients. We weren't involved in data collection. And that showed across 14 different conditions, we were statistically significant in the improvements in health and functioning. So for instance, if I bring that study up now, there was an 85% improvement in long COVID symptoms or health and functioning of long COVID patients after 6 months, or rather after 3 months minimum of using the program. There was a 70% improvement in ME and chronic fatigue syndrome, 67% improvement in mold illness, and it goes on, 14 different conditions. And I think it's the first time that it's ever been demonstrated that one intervention can improve between 50 to 100% the health and well-being of 14 different conditions. So that's a published independent study people can read as well.
Wow, and that's all available on your website, right? And we'll make sure that we get that website to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got more studies in the field right now, and we want to use independent objective markers. So far, people could argue, well, this is subjective markers. Now, in the fibromyalgia study, we did have one objective marker, which was BDNF levels in the brain, and those did normalize in the active group, but not in the control. So that's one objective marker we've had. But in future studies, we want to look at HRV, so heart rate variability, CRP, inflammatory load, autonomic function. We want to also measure some of those objective markers to show that things are really shifting in the body. And this isn't just some kind of, placebo effect. This is actually genuinely physical changes in the body.
That's fantastic. I'm just trying to, so I think we could continue to talk. I could continue to probe, and this, I find this fascinating. I sent you the list of questions I intended on asking, and you were like, that's a lot of questions. I have a lot more. But we're out of time here. I want to get to our wrap-up questions. And the first wrap-up question is, do you have a target age that you want to live to?
Well, I think because we have 10 fingers, 100 is always the target, I guess, that most people have. And for me, it's as we talk about longevity, obviously it's healthy years, isn't it? It's healthy years. That's what we want to do. And I think for me, it's being healthy of mind, healthy in body for at least 100 years would be great.
And how long do you think humans can live?
Well, I know there's been some studies saying it's 120, but in my view, actually, if we were to, there are stories, and who knows, right? But there are stories from the Far East that show that people live for hundreds of years. Now, who knows how true those are, by really living in a very precise way. And I do wonder, is it possible? Is it possible to live past that number? And if so, will the science support that? And I know there's a lot of work on, the science of longevity in terms of why do we get old? If we could switch that off, would we want to switch it off? How much would it cost to switch it off? So potentially, could this body, if we switch off some of those systems in the body, could it potentially last forever? Who knows?
So am I potentially forever?
Potentially forever.
Okay. I like that. And what 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets, let's call them shortcuts because everybody likes shortcuts, to longevity and a long health span can you share?
Right, so for longevity, number 1 would be meditation. A regular program of meditation. We know that meditation reduces the inflammatory load on the system. We know it increases neuroplasticity. We know it from a psychoneuroimmunology perspective, it calms the whole nervous system, so reduces our stress-related load on the system. It's just an all-round tonic that is beneficial, and obviously I shared that study. So that's number 1 is meditation. Number 2, people might be surprised to hear me say this, dancing. Dancing has been showed in terms of creating new neural pathways in the brain, making sure that we have coordination over the body, strengthening our system. Dancing has been number 1 as we get older. So that is a really, really powerful longevity tip. And interestingly, I was just reading today that they've just done some studies on all the various ways we can relieve depression. So they looked at SSRIs, they looked at CBT, they looked at jogging, walking, etc. And all of them can help. But the thing that was a massive outlier was dancing. And they studied 241 studies across 170,000 people. And dancing was twice as effective than CBT at reducing depression. And this is certainly something that we talk about in our program, the somatic work, the bodily work. When we're moving, we're dancing, we're getting in tune with our bodies, we're able to release a lot of that stored negativity, tension, bad energy, whatever you want to call it in our bodies. And so dancing would be my second longevity tip.
Excellent. You have a third? You don't need it, but do you have a third that pops to mind?
I have a third. Yes. So I think related to the calming of the mind and the physical exercise is definitely sleep. Sleep is something that we don't hold as sacred in our civilization. And the number 1 thing that's interrupting our sleep right now is evening devices. Mm-hmm. In the evenings, for the vast majority of our human history, we would dance around a fire, we would tell stories, we would laugh and joke. And now what do? We stare at a screen for 3 hours, and the television in the corner of our room is the campfire of our modern civilization. And this is to the detriment of our health. So in the evenings, switching off the screens, and at least the near screens. I mean, obviously, watching television is a far screen. It's not as bad, I believe, as watching a near screen. But engaging with things that make us laugh, that uplift us, that are the joy of socializing. Those kinds of things, I think, are so important to help us live longer.
All right. And what might you say 1 to 2 things people get absolutely wrong regarding longevity and a long health span?
Well, you want me to be controversial. I think that there's a lot of, arguments online about what kind of diet is the best to live the longest, right? And some people will say, no, it's this diet, it's a carnivore diet. I say, no, it's the vegan diet. No, it's the Mediterranean diet. No, it's this diet, it's the Ayurvedic diet, right? And I think what it is that people have to eat consciously versus sticking dogmatically to one way or the other. And what that means is, generally what I've seen is, across all of these diets, when we reduce processed foods and we reduce toxic foods and we start eating healthier, regardless of where you are on those different types of foods, generally we are removing the toxins from our food and eating more consciously and eating less so that we are maintaining our figure. And it's those components that are actually super important for longevity and well-being. So I think that can hopefully stop all the arguments that are continually going on about what is the best.
So don't fall into a dogma like just eat consciously.
Eat consciously and tune into what you find raises your energy, raises your vibrations. Yeah. And then I think, secondly, what do we get wrong? Did you say what we get wrong in terms of longevity or health in general?
I think longevity and a long health span.
Yeah, and a longer health span. So I think the biggest trap, I think, is thinking that some miracle drug is going to come along and suddenly save all of us. I think we're all, if you go to these longevity conferences and various things, and this is not to knock them, I think there are some great supplements out there. I think that, there's some great stuff. But realizing that has to be combined with the lifestyle changes. Yeah, you can't just rely on something external to suddenly make you live longer. We know that it's, if we look at the blue zones, for instance, and there's lots of controversy about that, but even in the blue zones, really, people are living to 100, over 100. Now, if you go to them and say, is it the miracle pill that did it? No, it's a combination of their lifestyle and their physical exercise and socializing and sleeping well and eating well and all these good things that are helping them live to longer age. So I think let's let go of the obsession of finding that miracle drug or supplement, and instead having a healthy lifestyle which will make us feel happier. So my mantra is always happier, healthier for longer.
I like it. Happier, healthier for longer. Ashok, how can people contact you?
So we'd love for people to come to our website, so guptaprogram.com, so that's Gupta program.com, and there they can find out lots of information about the Gupta program, and most importantly, they can take our free trial. So you can take a 28-day free trial. You don't even have to put your credit card in. You can get to experience some free videos, some free meditations, some free breath work, right? And even something I forgot to mention, we have something called Daily Gupta Size, which are daily Zoom calls with our health coaches and practitioners. Now, this is, I think, we're the only program that do this. And 200 or 300 people a day coming onto Zoom, meditating together, doing somatic work and breath work together. The power of that intention is amazing. Like, people have incredible breakthrough health experiences from being in that healing group. And we have brain retraining as well. So they can do some of that for free, join some of those Zoom calls. So we'd love for people to do that. And if you want to just download the app straight away, you can go to App Store or Play Store, type in Gupta Program, download the app, and start retraining your brain and benefiting from these tools straight away.
Excellent. And Ashok, what in the near future are you excited about?
What I'm excited about is this new revolution in medicine, which is we have focused on the physical body. Now we're opening up the brain. And although there's been a lot of excitement of obviously kind of genomics and editing genes and various things, I actually think that neuroplasticity and treating whole body disorders through the power of the brain is just as exciting, and that's what I'm excited about. That in 5 to 10 years' time, those 70% of illnesses that people go to see their doctor for, instead of prescribing pills, they will prescribe you neuroplasticity.
That's exciting. All right, so you can find him, GuptaProgram.com. That's Gupta program.com. You can actually just go ahead and get the app and take advantage of the free trial. I am taking advantage of the free trial. The time I've spent on it has been actually phenomenal. I think you've done a great job putting that together. And you say you have a daily Gupta, what is a Gupta size, like exercise?
Honestly named Daily Gupta Size, yes. So for the moment, we are offering the daily somatic breathwork and meditation for completely free. So people can, in the app on the free trial, still join Daily Gupta Size.
That's absolutely phenomenal. Ashok, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.